Do y'all think the mic is on? Okay. She says yes. All right, let's begin the class, and let me ask Chris to lead our prayer, please.
Father in heaven, come before you, thank you that you have given us in this past week we have and see us through it. We ask that you comfort those that are grieving and also be with those that are going through illness and help to heal them and speed them to much more health. Be with us now as we go through our class period. Help us go with open minds and be able to be receptive and be able to use what we've learned. In Christ's name we pray.
Okay, let me ask you a question. What percentage of the world's population would claim to be a Christian today? Do you know? Just a wild guess.
14%.
Excuse me?
14%.
14%. You're about half right. It's about 31%. And so about a third of the world's population claims to be a Christian today. And I think of this in terms of things that happened up until the death of Christ and his resurrection, and then things that happened after. And so if about a third of the world's population is a Christian, claims to be a Christian, and many of these people are not Christians in the sense that we would think of it. They would just check a box on, religion. And so some people would say Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, something like that. But about a third would say they're Christians. And so the question is, what happened leading up to the death of Christ, and what happened after the death of Christ and his resurrection that would enable a third of the world's population to claim to be a Christian today? How is that possible? And let me ask you another question. At the time that Jesus was crucified and was raised from the dead, do you think that there were any people who believed that he was going to be raised from the dead? Do you think that there was one person who did? We know that all the disciples forsook him and fled. Peter denied him. We're about to talk about the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And all of those people, or many of those people that were cheering him at the triumphal entry, were also in the crowd that said, "Crucify him." And so Mary Magdalene came to the tomb expecting him to be dead and not raised from the dead. And so I think that it is possible that not one person who traveled with him during his 3-year ministry, not one person believed that he would find the tomb empty and Jesus standing in the garden speaking to him. You see what I mean? And so we think of the ebb and flow of belief that people had in Jesus during his ministry. We know that there were times that he said things that made people leave him. We know that there were times that great crowds followed him, believing that he was going to feed them. And so all of these things were happening. He would have more people, fewer people, but it is possible that none of them really believed that he was going to be raised from the dead, and that if he was actually crucified, that would be the end for them. And so Today we're going to talk about the triumphal entry and sort of think about what happened leading up to that moment of his crucifixion. Now, we're in the 12th chapter today, and we talked about times when Jesus said, "My time has not yet come." And so that his life was not going to end prematurely. His ministry was going to be completed. But in chapter 13, verse 1, we see a verse that says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father." And then we'll have 5 chapters that talk about things that Jesus said to his disciples in preparation for chapter 18, when it says, verse 1, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples across the Kidron Valley." And so this is the march that Jesus and his disciples had up until that time that he was crucified. So we have 5 chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, that talk about things that Jesus said to his disciples. And in my Bible, almost everything in these chapters is in red. That is, almost everything in chapters 13 through 17 are words that Jesus said to his disciples near the end of his life. And so he was going to die and be buried, and then he would be raised from the dead. And somehow, this group of people who were all pessimistic and unbelieving at the time of his death came together at the day of Pentecost. 120 of them, only 120 were believers, and yet somehow now 1/3 of the world's population claims to be Christian. And so there's something about the story of Jesus that has compelled people to believe in him and to maintain this over 2,000 years of time. And so it's like the story of Apple Computer or Microsoft or something like that. It was a big success that seemed to not be a success. So let's take up chapter 12. And we talked about this story at the beginning of the chapter where Mary anointed Jesus, and Judas, it says, was critical of this waste of money. Now, in verse 9, it says, "When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only on account of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus also to death, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus." Now, we know that the Jews were becoming more and more obsessed with the popularity of Jesus. We know back in chapter 11, verse 47, it says, "So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, 'What are we to do? For this man performs many signs.'" They're becoming more and more concerned about him. They believe that he's going to create some type of insurrection that will bring the Romans down on them. And so they're even willing to murder Lazarus, even though the law of Moses says, "Thou shalt not kill," right? So that's where we are today. And now we talk about the triumphal entry. This is described in all 4 of the Gospels, the triumphal entry. And so let's begin reading verses 9 through 18. Bob, why don't you read those for us, okay? This is chapter 12, verses 9 through 18.
When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came, not only on account of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus also to death, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. The next day, a great crowd who had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out crying, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And Jesus found a young ass and sat upon it, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on an ass's colt. His disciples did not understand this at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that this had been written of him, and he had, written of him, and he had been done to him. The crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead bore witness. The reason why the crowd went to meet him was they had heard he had done this sign.
Okay. And then the last verse, the Pharisees then said to one another, You see that you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. And so this is the culmination of the concern that the Pharisees had about Jesus. And so they have a completely fatalistic approach to Jesus now. They're not going to be able to change him in any way. They can't restrain him. They can't discredit him. They've tried to discredit him by argumentation with him and by denying things that he said. And so now they know that there is no hope of dissuading Jesus from his mission. And so this means that they're going to have to do something about him. You see that you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Now, let's talk about the triumphal entry. And so the crowd is there because of the fame of Jesus. He is a celebrity, and Lazarus is a celebrity because he's been raised from the dead. And they want to see a celebrity, and they want for Jesus to give them something to eat. It's a big celebration, but they're reckless in their in the way that they tout Jesus as the King of Israel. They believe that Jesus is probably the Messiah. They probably do, although many of them are just there for kind of a celebration type of thing. But they do connect this with Old Testament prophecies. And so what is going on when he gets on this donkey and rides into Jerusalem? What is it? What does it look like, David? Exactly. The king is arriving, and it's the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. They believe that Jesus is going to become a king. And they believe that his ability to work miracles makes it such that not only will he become a king in the worldly sense, but perhaps he will be able to, to throw the Romans out, which would seem very implausible. It certainly seems implausible to the Jews, to the Pharisees. They don't think anybody can throw the Romans out. They want to maintain the status quo because the status quo is pretty good for them. They've got peace, they've got enough prosperity, and so they're willing to accept this condition of subjugation to the Romans in order to maintain a pretty good status quo, right? And so this triumphal entry takes place, and this is what it took place on what people today call Palm Sunday. That is, it took place about a week or so before the events of his crucifixion and resurrection. And so it was 6 days before the Passover. And they came because of Lazarus and the tomb. The Jews must have been extremely concerned about this huge commotion. And they had 1,000 Romans down in the Antonia fortress. David probably saw that on his trip, or saw where it might have been. But the Romans had a fortress in Jerusalem, and they had a garrison of soldiers there. They had Roman officials, and we know that this is what happened at the time that Jesus was crucified, because we see the Jews capturing him, bringing him before the Romans, presenting him before Roman officials, and then turning him over to the Romans, who took him into the Praetorium, the fortress that was occupied by the Romans. And so these Romans are here, and a great commotion is taking place where Jesus is being brought into the city. Now, we don't know how large this crowd was, but certainly there was a crowd that did this. And so when he came in, the Jews were very upset about it. Let's begin to read verse 20 through 23. David, why don't you read that? Okay.
Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn Andrew and Philip told Jesus. But Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified.
Okay, who were these Greeks? What are the possibilities about who the Greeks were? What's one possibility? Right. They were Greeks that had become converted to Judaism. They were proselytes. And so, do we know of any people who might have been proselytes? You know, the Ethiopian eunuch was a minister of Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, and he had come to Jerusalem to worship. He may have been a proselyte, you know. And so he might have been. And so what other category of people might be discussed when it says Greeks who had come to Jerusalem? Pat, who might it be? Right. It may have been just any Gentile who had heard that Jesus was there and wanted to come and see him. It might have been Hellenized Jews that lived out in the Greek world, and the whole world was Greek, really, because even when the Romans conquered the Greeks, the Romans spread Greek culture. That is, it was not Roman culture that was spread by the Romans. It was Greek culture, because Greek culture was the dominant culture of the entire world. It was the most elevated type of thinking that existed in the world, and the Romans adopted the Greek culture and spread it. And so these might have been Jews that lived in the Greek world who were Hellenistic Jews, you call them. And so at any rate, there were people that were called Greeks that might have been of several different categories, and they came and asked to see Jesus. And this request was passed on sort of through the disciples. And so, what was the result of this? Did Jesus say, well, bring them on in, let's talk to them? He didn't say that. It doesn't relate anything like that. And it doesn't say that he said, well, I don't want to talk to them. It doesn't tell us what became of these Greeks. It says that he says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And so, can you imagine what the Greeks might have wanted to talk to Jesus about? Maybe they were just curious to see him. They had heard about him. They wanted to meet him. They might have wanted to throw some support to him or talk him out of what he was trying to do. We don't know exactly what their motivation was, but they seem to be from outside the circle of these people in Jerusalem that Jesus was dealing with constantly on a daily basis. They seem to be exterior people. But Jesus says, I think, my ministry has come to an end. The ministry that I have has come to an end, and now the concluding events of his life are going to take place. And when he says this, he says it, he doesn't say, it's time for me to be crucified. He says, it's time for me to be glorified. And so, what events do we know without having read in advance? What events do we believe that Jesus is talking about when he says, it's time for me to be glorified instead of it's time for me to be crucified? What do you think he's saying, David?
I would have thought it had reference to the whole process of what he's headed toward, including the resurrection.
Exactly. That is, we know that even though things are going to take place that are negative, we know that the eventual outcome of this is going to be positive. And so he doesn't speak of this making reference to the very negative aspects of what is going to take place. He speaks of it in reference to the positive things that are going to take place. Yes.
In reading this before, I was looking at this and trying to decide, were the Greeks with, alongside of Andrew and Philip as they approached Jesus? And they came to Philip. Philip goes to Andrew. Was the entourage of Greeks, however large there was in the group, whether it was 3 or 12 or whatever, were they kind of following along, and were they there in the hearing of this comment from Jesus?
It's hard to say. We don't know if they even ever saw Jesus, right?
It doesn't say one way or the other.
Right. It doesn't. To me, it's an enigmatic event. And we don't know exactly, after this message was passed on, we don't know if the Jews ever saw Jesus, if they ever talked to him.
Well, how is this an answer to the question of the Greeks coming to him? That puzzles me as I was reading it. Is that Jesus answered the disciples, or answered Andrew and Philip?
Yeah.
What was the question?
Yeah, I think that the answer was, I'm going to take a completely different direction. I think that the day before this happened, the week before this happened, if these Greeks had come to Jesus, he would have said, well, I'll be glad to talk to them. But I think that at this point, the time for talking to people in this manner was over, and that there was going to be a trajectory of his life that led to the crucifixion, and that his life was taking a different turn. To me, this represents sort of a fork in the road. That's the way I interpret it. And beyond that, we just don't have any more information. Anybody have an opinion or a comment about it? Right.
And I don't know if that together is just Andrew and Philip.
Yeah, I don't believe that the
whole
Greeks,
congregation.
I don't believe that the Greeks were in the company of people who went to Jesus.
Just Andrew and
Right,
Philip.
yeah. Okay,
Proselytes,
excuse me?
are they proselytes?
We don't know that they could, in that it referred to them as Greeks. As we discussed, they could be any number of different types of Greeks.
Why would they be going up to worship?
Right, that's like the Ethiopian eunuch. He had gone to Jerusalem to worship and was returning to Ethiopia. And so I assume my opinion would be that they are either proselytes or Hellenized Greek Jews. I sort of agree with that. John, did you have a comment in the back?
It just seemed to me like he didn't even address the issue that people totally went a different direction.
Say that again. I'm hard of hearing, as my wife will tell you.
It just seemed like it was a distraction almost, and that his focus was on obedience to what he was there to do. So I was just reading it, I wondered, why didn't he address that at all directly? What does that mean to us, that he just launches into this, what he's going to do, and it just seemed like obedience. Like he was trying to tell us that his focus is on doing what God has put him there to do.
Right. I think that is correct. Yes. Somebody else.
It almost feels like the reason we're told this is to let us know that there were Greeks from outside the boundaries of the Jewish community coming in from all over the world to see Jesus.
You mean that his fame had extended just outside the local region?
Right, and if
Yeah.
you apply today's standards, they may have been able to book him on a tour to go out and seriously healing all over the known world.
Right. They may have been entrepreneurial Greeks. Yeah. Well, we know that on the day of Pentecost, one of the things that led to the explosive spread of the gospel was the fact that people were in Jerusalem from all over the place, right? And so they were there for a purpose. It's just like when the Muslims make their pilgrimage to Mecca. Those people are from all over the world. And that's the way it was in Jerusalem at this time, I think. Okay. Let's see. Did somebody else have a comment? No. Okay. All right. Now, Jesus says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life," well, let's stop with that. And so he says, he uses this figure of the grain of wheat falling into the earth and dying. And of course, we believe that when he's talking about the growth of a seed, it seems to lose its viability when it falls into the earth. It seems to die. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And so it bears fruit by growing up into something bigger. And so that is what, I mean, it's obvious what he's talking about, I think. Don't you think so? He's going to die, and then the seed will grow up into a plant that will bear much fruit. He who loves his life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there shall my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. All of these things Jesus is saying to prepare his disciples for the time when he is going to die, when they're going to be disappointed, and yet their spirits will be revived after the resurrection. And because of training that he has given to them, experiences that they have had with him, these people are going to lead the growth of the church into a third of the world's population 2,000 years later. And so he's teaching them all the time. He's constantly teaching his disciples, realizing that one day he is going to leave them. Imagine if you were the disciples and saw Jesus ascend into heaven, never to return. Imagine what you would think. How can I accomplish the purpose that Jesus has brought about? You know, our preacher, David, here, came into a congregation that had been established for decades before he ever got here. And he's got to get up and preach and try to keep the congregation from going into apostasy and growing and things like that. But imagine if there was no church at all, and if Jesus had left you, and you were left with the task of trying to start the church from zero. You know, that's what the apostles had to do. And so everything that Jesus said to them was preparing them for that time. And we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was successful, that they were able to pull this off because of what he taught them. He says, "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, for this purpose I've come to this hour. Father, glorify thy name." Then a voice came from heaven, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." The crowd standing by heard it, and said that it had thundered. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." Jesus answered, "This voice has come for your sake, not for mine." And so all of this is, this is a testimonial from God, from heaven, a voice from heaven authenticating the ministry of Jesus, authenticating the identity of Jesus before people that are going to have to be entrusted with a difficult task just in just a few days. And when when David introduced the raising of Lazarus, he did make mention of this verse that says that he is going to go do something that is going to make the disciples believe. And then after he had done this, he said, "I knew that thou hearest me always, but I've said this on account of the people standing by, that they may believe that thou didst send me." And so all of these things are sort of similar in their purpose of teaching and training and preparing. And Jesus knows that he's got just less than a week to finish this up. Any comments about that, David?
An overall picture of the disciples trying to really wrap their head around who Jesus really is. When they're in Matthew 17 on the mountain and transfigured, the ground quaked and God spoke, and the three disciples that were there fell over at Jesus' feet. They were finally presented with who Jesus was in that moment. But when everything cleared and they looked up, it was just Jesus again. It was back to life. And I don't know if they wrapped their heads around that this is the Son of God yet. They're still trying to build 3 little temples or whatever to honor each one that was present.
Right.
Moses and Elijah and Jesus.
Right. They were going to do something trivial.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, as we're looking at this, grasping this is God's Son, although it was vocalized by Peter, at least in Matthew 16, and a couple of the women along the way at different times. But still, to think about, he's going to die and be resurrected, and everything's going to be good. Like you said, there was nobody that went to the tomb that morning, except the women who were going to anoint a dead body.
That's right.
It wasn't like they had been up all night long, anxious for that morning, so they could rush down and meet Jesus standing outside the tomb.
Exactly.
Nobody thought that.
Right.
And so he's trying to prepare them, and they still can't grasp it, even at this moment, of what's going on. So the voice speaks out one more time to at least help them know that God, who they've never seen, is involved in this. And grasping is still hard for them.
Yes. And we see that the disciples have increasing faith. Jesus calmed the sea 2 times. The first time he calmed the sea, they were in the boat, and a storm came up. And when Jesus calmed the sea, the disciples said, "What sort of man is this that even winds and sea obey him?" But then the second time, when he walked on the sea in Matthew 14 and came to him and then calmed the sea, they said, "Truly you are the Son of God." And so I think that they believed him, but the ability to actually comprehend what this means and what's going to happen is beyond them. And so God is giving his testimony to Jesus at this time, I think, a voice from heaven. Any other comments about that? Okay. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the ruler of this world be cast out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. And so the implications of this, what Jesus says right here, are sort of cosmic implications. And these, what he says right here, refers to a conflict between God and Satan that arose in the Garden of Eden. And so that's the type of things that are at stake in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Certainly, redemption is important there. Our redemption, but in a greater sense, there is a conflict between God and Satan that is going to come into play in this. And so that's why Jesus said, now shall the ruler of this world be cast out. And then he goes on to say, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. The people understand what this means, to be lifted up. And so they go on to say, he said that this was to show what death he was to die. The crowd answered him, "We've heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man?" And so they don't even know that Jesus is speaking about himself. They don't know exactly what he's talking about. Still, the crowd is uncertain as to what he means when he says, "And I, when I am lifted up." They've just come into Jerusalem celebrating him as the King of Israel. And so they understand that he's saying that this phrase, "when I'm lifted up," they understand that this is about his death. That's not unknown to them. And so who's going to be lifted up? If you are the King of Israel, then how is it possible that you are going to be lifted up or killed, and that all these things that we've been celebrating are going to come to pass? So who is this Son of Man? Are you talking about yourself? Surely not. Surely you must be talking about someone else. And so this expression, Son of Man, is an enigmatic expression that Jesus has used throughout his ministry. And I think that it's puzzling even to me that he refers to himself as the Son of Man at various times. I know that sometimes he does it to conceal the claims that he makes for himself. But at this moment, it has just confused the people. Jesus said to them, "The light is with you for a little longer. Walk while you have the light, lest the darkness overtake you. He who walks in the darkness does not know where he goes. while you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of light. This statement that he makes closely resembles something that he made at another time. Do you know when he made a statement like this at another time? When he said something like, walk while you have the light, lest the darkness overtake you. He who walks in the darkness does not know where he goes. When did he say something like that? He said it when he was telling the disciples that they were going to go to Lazarus. That is, he said this to the disciples when they were concerned about their safety as they went over to see Lazarus after he had died. He said that to the disciples at that time. Okay, any comments about that? All right.
I wonder if
Oh,
that comment that he makes, now the rule of this world is going to be cast out. If there weren't 10,000 angels in heaven shouting amen, because they were waiting since the garden that he would finally be thrown out.
right. And this is, this is a pivotal moment in history. And so,
Spiritually speaking, it is.
yeah, and in 1 Corinthians 15, when the resurrection was being discussed and things were being placed in their proper context, the last enemy to be destroyed is death, because the main enemy was actually overcome at the time of the resurrection. And so at the time that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15, the only thing left was for the end of the world to come and for death and Hades to be thrown into the lake of fire. That is, death would come to an end, and there would be only eternal life. And so, anyway, Jesus continues to say these things about his disciples, and I think that again it has to do with the concept of courage. He's trying to get his disciples to be courageous, because it's gonna require a lot of courage for them. We know that when Peter denied Jesus, the night of his capture and so forth, that turned out to be an inconsequential event, right? Peter went on to confess Jesus in his life, and to be courageous in his ministry, in his own ministry. And so that was an inconsequential event, and the courage that Jesus was encouraging them to have. Walk in the light. Open your eyes. Go ahead and just take off and do something. Follow me over to Lazarus, even though you think that there may be some danger in it. That's what he's trying to teach the disciples, I think. When Jesus had said this, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, yet they did not believe in him. It was that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, for Isaiah again said, He has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they should see with their eyes and perceive with their heart and turn for me to heal them. Isaiah said this because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Now, we know that on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people became Christians. That the things that Jesus had done in preparation for his death and resurrection were brought to fruition so that 3,000 people were baptized on the day of Pentecost. And we know that a couple of chapters later, there were 5,000 men, of course ignoring the women and children, but the church had a rapid growth, and now a third of the world's population says that they're Christians. And that is the success of these people who were disbelieving, afraid to confess him because of the Pharisees, people who love the praise of men more than the praise of God. All of these flawed individuals who were struggling to understand, eventually, after the day of Pentecost, they came through because of the preparation that Jesus had given them. And Jesus cried out, and is it time to stop the class? Okay, well, David has got the next 2 weeks, unless he's called away because he's going into labor. And so he'll take up with verse 44.